work of Corrie Keyes, who is actually a sociologist and was, you'll see, a collaborator with Carol Riff. So he's someone who's very much grounding his work on what she started. And whilst you'll see that one of the dimensions of Carol Riff's dimensions of psychological well-being talk about positive relations with others, so I think she's just touching upon this. What Corrie Keyes was doing and trying to extend it, and again, bearing in mind he's a sociologist, so therefore maybe he's more interested in more of those sociological and social aspects. So he extends Riff's work and is exploring then actually to really fully understand somebody who is living, and he'll use this term, a flourishing life and scoring high on measures of flourishing, then you've got to include these social dimensions. And he sort of puts them under there. In terms of giving you a way of thinking about each of these things, so social coherence will relate to your being interested in society and social life, and you find them meaningful and somewhat intelligible. One of the wordings there. So social coherence means you've got an interest in society and social life more generally, finding them meaningful and intelligible. So that's what social coherence is referring to. And the second will be another way of summarising these, which may help it even cement more clearly. Social actualisation will represent a belief that people, groups and society have potential and can evolve or grow positively. So you can almost, a bit like self-actualisation, but social actualisation, having those thoughts and beliefs about people in general, groups and society having that potential. Social integration is a sense of belonging to and comfort and support from a community. So you don't necessarily need to be writing all these down word for word, but it's just a way of giving you a sense of what these things are referring to. Social acceptance holds positive attitudes towards and acknowledges and it's accepting of human differences, so recognising that there are differences, so holding positive attitudes towards that, acknowledging it and accepting of it. And finally, social contribution will be sees one's own daily activities as useful to and valued by society and others. So that's one way it's summarised. Another way on the bottom of here, it's taken from Keyes 2002, just my notes bit, which is individuals are functioning, so if you were scoring high on various measures, then you would argue within that you would see society as meaningful as understandable, so that's what we mean by social coherence, as possessing potential for growth, when they feel they belong to and accepted by their communities, when they accept most parts of society, and when they see themselves as contributing to society. So that's another way of summarising it even more. So that's actually taken from Keyes. So the idea here is that we're now emphasising the role of these kinds of social elements, which you would argue that Riff's work hadn't really paid enough attention to.
Matthew,
yeah.
These two approaches, are they sometimes used as a hybrid, i.e. that you've got Keyes' dimensions boiled down into an additional dimension to Riff's work, or are they seen as sort of standalone diagnostic tools?
So I hope that question has been picked up on the recording, because it's brilliant in lots of ways, both in terms of you're asking the right questions there and picking up on exactly what we're going to be talking about. So some of his work is very much bringing it together. You read something already, have you, Regis?
This is my one epiphany for the year.
And even the term diagnostic as well, which is interesting in terms of his work. I'm also now aware of what the next slide is saying, which was going to be, that was going to be our lunch break. We can blame visiting Professor Alex Lindley for being delayed on that. However, and I don't just want to rush through some of these final bits, and there's bits of it I think I'd like to spend some time on, so we may defer some of that to the start of next time. It's not going to cause any problems, rather than try and rush through it, or leave it out altogether. So just be mindful of that. So, but we will touch upon at least what Neil's raised there. So I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. One way we'll do this probably is, I think I'll probably save this discussion. So the idea was I present this and we discuss this, and we haven't really got time to do that, but it's actually a really important point. So I think we'll defer some of that discussion to the start of next time, because it relates back to that definition we started this morning with in terms of what we mean by mental health. And there's a lot going on there. Maybe having started to explore some of Corey Key's work, over the next few weeks thinking about that more, we can come back to that. So that's where that was going to be for a while. So again, we're going to come back here a little bit. But what we'll do, because the reason why we're going to discuss it then, is that in terms of Corey Key's work, he was particularly in this idea of trying to understand mental health, and by that essentially you're meaning mental health, positive mental health. Often when you see the discussion of this notion of mental health, we may be talking actually about what is often in the past been called mental illness, or mental health issues, or another term to cover issues relating to what is often called mental illness. So therefore mental health referring to health problems or something, rather than when somebody's mentally healthy, positive mental health, what does that look like? So what he's arguing, again, is a very short quote here, is that a syndrome of symptoms, so already we have this idea of the terminology, a syndrome of symptoms, which is quite interesting, but of positive feelings and positive functioning in life. And what he's argued is that historically there's been a lot of literature, a lot of attempts to get a clear diagnostic criteria of when people are suffering from various problems, how you might diagnose that. And there's the big diagnostic statistical manual, I think on version 5 now. So a great big thick manual where if you want to find out if you're suffering from any of these particular psychological disorders or mental illnesses, whatever term you want to use, then you can go through these books and they say, do I hit these criteria? And if they do, then perhaps I'm suffering from some of these issues. So it's very much been an approach used to diagnose illness in general, and in that context, psychological illness. But what he's argued is that actually taking some of those ideas, or that approach, to understand, and to some extent maybe even diagnose, he often talks about these diagnostic criteria, somebody who is flourishing, experiencing positive mental health. And that's where two terms that come around in terms of his work is somebody who would score high on all of these aspects, and that's both including his social dimensions that we briefly mentioned there, and the kind of dimension we've already looked at in depth that Riff has discovered. So yes, very much combining what he's adding to Riff's work. So it is seen as a kind of combined thing. So these terms, flourishing and languishing, are two terms which we'll think a bit more about.
Can I just add just a personal comment on that? Within organisations, I've found that when you mention mental ill health, it's a real negative. And so I've not come across this expression, positive mental health. And I think if I was expressing myself with positive mental health, it makes such a difference. And those barriers would be easy to break down. The stigma which you have just in the words changes the emphasis completely.
And a big word in it, I think, for non-psychologists and normal people, is a word mental. So often again, I'm sure there was some discussion in the context of something called 5 Ways to Wellbeing. A lot of people are familiar with some of that. So it's part of kind of public health attempts to get across some of the ideas we talk about that are in Power of Happiness and other books. Things you can do to help improve your own well-being. So doing some work with Buckinghamshire County Council about how you build it into a campaign. But anything is this idea like, do we want to use the word mental well-being? But from those perspectives, saying, I'm not sure that's going to do us the service that we want.
I was told to tone it down and change the language.
And it is, it's finding language again that people are comfortable with, but it's still telling us what it is. We're going back to some of the issues that Dina raised in terms of studying happiness. I know it's a different kind of issue, but still, what do we call what it is we're talking about here? And I think Riff's work on psychological well-being does a good job of bringing it together. Again, for a lot of people, well, what do you mean by psychological? We have a shared understanding of that, and we try to tease it apart. But yes, so some of these terms are raise their own questions. He's talked about it in terms of trying to diagnose positive mental health, and we'll see that these two terms, whether or not somebody is flourishing, who is then scoring high on those kinds of measures, whereas languishing is scoring lower, but it may not necessarily mean they are suffering from mental illness. And that's why that quote, which we will return to at the start of next time, and so you could think about and reflect on is it the idea that mental health is simply the absence of mental illness? This is something we can come back and explore in more depth next time. So, because what he's arguing is basically then they are not just the opposite end of the same spectrum, they're distinct but related but distinct, which we want to say it, dimensions. So what I want to do, this is what I want to spend maybe the last bit of the day then. I won't get you to look at quite the same depth as you've really explored, but I'm going to add to what you've already looked at. Keyes has 13 criteria. So again, we're talking about these terms, a syndrome of things, symptoms. Often think these are being diagnostic criteria, but we're not trying to diagnose illness. We're trying to see, can we identify people who are flourishing? So to do that, I'm going to just let you have a little look at Keyes 13 criteria. So take one of these and pass to the back. And there will be some spares. We'll just take one each. And this is on Blackboard, as is the ones we got earlier. This one. The spares there.
One more.
What is that one? Oh. He'll dub it over. I didn't swear like that. So, you can see there are 13 criteria. I know she's gone. She did say sometimes she might need to leave. So, put it down here. Is this your stuff or is that?
That's my bit.
Yeah.
That's okay.
So it's on Blackboard as well anyway, but now you have your own printed one on yellow paper. So these are the 13 criteria. So you'll see there are elements in there which are including riffs we've looked at in some depth. And here it's been written as though these are symptoms now, and a little bit like you get when you diagnose something, you think, right, well, if you score high on at least one of these and X number of these, so let's look at that. So he distinguishes something called hedonia, which is more, you can see in terms of how you've got that affect balance, how your ongoing feelings in terms of cheerfulness and so on. So it's a little bit like the initial notion of subjective well-being, because you can see there's two elements to it. One is regularly cheerful, in good spirits, happy, calm and peaceful, and full of life. So some degree of positive affect past 30 days. The idea is you're thinking about it in terms of the last 30 days, trying to be quite specific in terms of thinking of these as criteria. So you would score high on at least one of those. Okay? Plus high levels of at least 6 measures of positive functioning. So those last from 3 down to 13, these are measures of positive functioning. So if you're scoring highly on 6 or more of them, plus you're scoring highly on at least one of the first 2, then you would have a diagnosed as flourishing, identified as flourishing. Is that okay? Any thoughts about that? Should we move on? Have we all discussed out so far?
Is this just like I read the first one and go, yeah, that's me, or is it someone else's?
It'll be another, so there's actually a scale again. You'll see it's built round Carol Riff's works, the later items. I haven't got to hand the actual questionnaire that's used to do it, so it'll be scoring highly rather than